Adventure Master Studios here. How y'all doing? So, when it comes to my channel, over the past few videos, I've taken a look at the old graphic novels that we've gotten when it comes to Ninjago. Some of the old additional stories that we got for the franchise that weren't told in the show. And in today's video, I want to go all the way back to the very beginning. The very first graphic novel that we ever got for the franchise, the thing that kickstarted it all, and really one of our first major instances of us getting some additional story content when it comes to the franchise. With that being, again, the first ever Ninjago graphic novel, The Challenge of Samukai. In today's video, I'm going to take a look at this. So, let's get into this whole thing. So, when it comes to the story, it starts off, unsurprisingly, in the underworld, where we see Samukai, with him lamenting over how, with Garmadon being in charge, things for him haven't really been that great overall. With one thing in particular that he's been really mad about, being the fact that him and the Skullkins haven't been able to defeat the ninja, with him thinking that if Garmadon wasn't around, then they might actually be able to achieve stuff, they might be able to defeat the ninja and get the golden weapons. Garmadon, however, ends up overhearing this, and when he hears Samukai talking about how he'd be able to take on and defeat the ninja, Garmadon proposes a wager between the two of them, and this ends up being a major focus when it comes to the story. Garmadon challenges Samukai to actually go out and defeat the ninja, simple as that. He can use anything at his disposal, all the resources of the underworld, his army, he can use whatever he wants. All he has to do is find some way to defeat the ninja and Sensei Wu, simple as that. And if Samukai is able to do that, then Garmadon will actually step down as ruler of the underworld, and he'll actually end up serving Samukai. However, if that doesn't happen, then not only will Garmadon remain in control of the underworld, but he also tells Samukai that he'll have to leave Ninjago as well. So Samukai sets out in order to try and find some way to defeat the ninja and win this wager between him and Garmadon. And again, this is a big part of the story, and honestly, this is something that I really like. When it comes to Garmadon and Samukai, the rivalry and hatred these two had for one another, although it wasn't a major focus of the pilot season, is something that I still thought was genuinely really interesting. When it came to Garmadon and Samukai, these two really did not like one another, yet they essentially were forced to work alongside one another if they actually wanted to take over Ninjago. So even though they didn't like working together, they ultimately had no choice but to do it, and again, the two of them hated it as a result of it. And I like that when it comes to this graphic novel, we actually get the chance to see more of this rivalry between the two of them, with the two of them essentially doing whatever they can in order to outsmart the other one, in order to try and knock the other one down in some way or another. This is something that I do honestly think is really great to see. Not only that, but when it comes to the two of them, they both believe that they will be able to win this wager in the end. However, as we'll see throughout the story, things don't really go that well for either of them actually. So after this, things end up taking a bit of a turn in comparison to what we usually see with the graphic novels. Ordinarily, the graphic novels will end up having one long story that's told throughout the entire book. However, that's not the case when it comes to this story, and instead, we end up getting 4 short stories, although each of them do relate into the overall plot of that previously mentioned wager between Samukai and Garmadon. So when it comes to the first short story, it is called Origins, and it's exactly that. It's the origins of things when it comes to Ninjago. And essentially what we end up getting here is a loose retelling of stuff that we saw during the very first episode of Ninjago. We learn about the origins of Ninjago and how it was created by the first Spinjitzu master using the 4 golden weapons. We see Wu and Garmadon fighting against one another and Garmadon being banished. The reveal that Garmadon is going to be returning at some point, and Sensei Wu going out in order to recruit the ninja, with him recruiting Cole, Zane, and Jay all relatively quickly, and some more time is focused on Kai, which makes sense because he was the original main character of the franchise at this point. Where we see him and Nia in the 4 weapons blacksmith shop, we see the Skullkins attacking, Nia getting captured, and the Skullkins taking the map to the golden weapons, and we see Kai being recruited by Sensei Wu and trained to become a ninja, which we also end up seeing. And then eventually we see the original 4 ninja team properly being formed. Like I said, it's a very loose retelling of the first episode of the show, essentially, with us seeing a variety of stuff that we did see there, although not everything is exactly the same. Some events don't entirely line up with how they actually went down during the show, and pretty much none of the dialogue is the same across either of these things, but still, I feel like this does work fairly well as an origin story when it comes to stuff in Ninjago. And at the end of the short story, Samukai then talks about going after Kai specifically, given how he's the newest member of the ninja team and how he does care a lot about the other members of the team. He thinks that by going after Kai first, he might be able to find some way to break up the team, thus ending the first short story, which overall I think is honestly fairly solid. Again, it's basically a retelling of the first episode of the show, but overall, again, I do think it works fairly well as an origin for things when it comes to Ninjago. So moving on, we then have the second short story, Turnabout. Initially, we see Crunch and Knuckle, with the two of them talking about a plan to lure Kai into some kind of trap, with Kai eventually seeing Knuckle and he chases after him, leading him into a place known as the Crystal Caves. Not to be confused with the Crystal Caves that were present during Season 4, this is a completely different location. So anyway, Kai ends up going into the caves and he just ends up getting a headache, and that's about it. So he ends up going back to the ninja team. However, everyone is really angry at him for some reason, and everyone immediately plans to go after Kai and attack him for some reason. Kai's really confused about what's going on, telling everyone that it's him, but no one believes him. Not even Sensei Wu, who tells the rest of the ninja to attack him. So Kai does what he can in order to fight off the rest of the team. That is until he realizes what's going on. When he takes a look at his reflection in a river, he realizes that he looks like a Skullkin, so that's why the other ninja are attacking him. Kai is able to get away from the team, and so he tries to come up with a plan on what to do next. He goes back to his home village thinking that maybe he might be able to convince people that it's really him. However, that doesn't work, and the people are just angry at him and throw rocks at him. So at this point, Kai really isn't too sure about what to do, but then he gets an idea. He thinks that if he can go back to the Crystal Caves and go through them again, he might end up reversing his situation and he might end up looking like himself again. So he makes his way to the Crystal Caves, but unfortunately the rest of the team finds him, so Kai once again has to fight against J. Cole and Zane. Luckily though, Kai is able to hold them off for just long enough for him to make his way to the caves, while also fighting against a confused Knuckle in the process, which I think is kind of funny. And anyway, Kai is able to make his way through the caves, and once he exits them, he looks just like his old self again, and everyone recognizes him, which is good. But then the story comes to an end, revealing that with J. Cole and Zane going through the caves, all of them now look like Skullkins, and Kai's the only one who knows what's going on, which I do think is actually kind of funny. So overall, when it comes to the story, I think it's fairly solid. I mean, it's a pretty simple story overall, but still I feel like it's able to work. I like that we end up getting some stuff with Kai. I feel like it works well, especially since, again, he was the original main protagonist here. Plus, also, I think the idea of the Crystal Caves causing someone to look like a Skullkin is an interesting idea, and I feel like Samukai going after Kai first, with him being the newest member of the team, does make sense as a way to try and weaken the team. So overall, when it comes to the story, I do think it is honestly fairly solid overall. So moving on, we then have the third short story, A Choice of Dooms, with this one actually focusing on Cole. At the beginning of the story, we learn that Samukai has taken Kai and Jay as prisoners, and for some reason it's never mentioned where Zane is, which I do think is kind of weird, but I digress. And when it comes to Kai and Jay, the two of them are trapped inside of a cave, and Cole has to choose which cave to go down in order to find them. Unfortunately though, there is a trap that is placed in both the caves. One cave contains a gigantic wolf, and the other one contains a bunch of swinging axes. So Cole has to choose which of these to go down. Cole then thinks back to earlier in the day in hopes that maybe this will be able to help him out, and this is where we end up getting most of the story. When it comes to Cole, we learn that Sensei Wu has set up a test for him, specifically one revolving around him having to make difficult choices quickly due to him being the leader of the ninja team. And this is something that I do honestly like, this graphic novel actually acknowledging Cole being the leader of the team, because that was initially Cole's role back in the earlier days of the franchise. Prior to Lloyd becoming the leader, Cole was the leader. So again, this is something that I do think is actually pretty cool, honestly. So anyway, Cole ends up going through with the test. He makes his way down into a forest before eventually coming to a fork in the road, where Cole ends up learning that some bandits ended up stealing something, and Cole has to decide which path to go down, with there being two paths, with there being footprints in each of them. Cole ends up going down one path, noticing that the footprints in that one are deeper, and so he decides to go down that path, thinking that the bandits probably stole something valuable and heavy. So he ends up making his way down that path, only for him to learn that this wasn't actually the right path, because the bandits didn't actually steal anything that was heavy. As it turns out, they actually stole a book, with the idea being that they stole knowledge, meaning that Cole ended up going down the wrong path. And this is something that I do think is kind of weird because there wasn't any hint suggesting that Cole going down this path was wrong, and I do think that Cole's reasoning makes sense. So him going down this path, I think it does make sense. So this being revealed to be the incorrect path, that is kind of weird, I think. But anyway, Cole ends up going down the other path where he ends up making his way to the top of a mountain, where he learns that the bandits ended up crossing a rushing river and Cole has to figure out some way to also get across that river. Suddenly, a gigantic bird ends up flying by Cole, and that's when he gets an idea. He ends up taking some rope and he wraps it around the bird's talons, and the bird is actually able to carry him across the river. Cole eventually makes his way to the other side of it, where he then has to battle against the bandits. Meanwhile, Samukai ends up hearing about what Cole is doing, so he decides to interfere with this, with him capturing Kai and Jay and using the two of them as bait in order to try and lure Cole into some kind of trap. Meanwhile, back with Cole, he is ultimately able to defeat the bandits and he plans to continue on with the test, but Samukai ends up intervening, where he reveals that Kai and Jay have been taken as prisoners, thus bringing us back to the beginning of the story. Samukai is pressuring Cole in order to make a choice, but he's not sure about which path to go down. That is until he notices something weird, and it's that the giant axes are being surrounded by flies, and that ends up tipping Cole off as to what to do. So he ends up going down the path with the axes, where he ends up breaking all of them, because as it turns out, the axes weren't actually made of metal. Turns out they were actually made of sugar the entire time, and that's why flies were surrounding them. Which I do think is something really strange, because why would Samukai end up creating fake axes to try and trick Cole? Remember, Samukai is trying to defeat the ninja, so why wouldn't he just use real axes? Again, he's trying to stop Ninja. Why create a fake scenario instead of having both of them be real? That is kind of strange when you really think about it and what Samukai wants to do. But anyway, Cole is ultimately able to find Kai and Jay, and he frees them, and the two of them end up fighting against the Skullkins, and Cole tries to go after Samukai, but Samukai ends up escaping back to the underworld. However, Kai and Jay have been saved, so the group end up making their way back to Sensei Wu. And overall, I'd say that this is the weakest out of the short stories. I don't think it's bad or anything, and I do like that we end up getting some focus on Cole. I think that is honestly pretty good. That being said, though, there were definitely things about this story that didn't really make the most amount of sense. Stuff like, again, Cole going down the wrong path, even though there wasn't anything suggesting that it was the wrong path, as well as, again, Samukai not using real axes when using real ones arguably would have made a lot of sense considering what he was trying to do. And again, where was Zane during this? It is kind of confusing. But yeah, overall, again, I would say this is the weakest out of the short stories that we end up getting. So finally, this brings us into the fourth of the stories, with this being called The Trap. We start off seeing the ninja coming up with some kind of plan on what to do about the Skullkins. However, they aren't too sure about how to go about things, considering what they do have is really risky, but they're ultimately going to go through with it anyway. Unfortunately, though, Cruncha ends up overhearing them, so he ends up rushing back telling Samukai about what's going on, revealing what the ninja have planned, as well as also revealing where Sensei Wu is, as it turns out. So Samukai ends up having the Skullkins going out in order to deal with the ninja, and the ninja do end up getting caught off guard by the Skullkins. However, it's not actually the ninja. As it turns out, the ninja ended up setting traps for the Skullkins, and they actually planned on having Cruncha overhear their plans. And what the ninja did was they set up dummy versions of themselves in order to trick the Skullkins into going after them, only for the Skullkins to end up getting caught in traps that were set up by the ninja, which I do think is honestly something really interesting to see. And also, fun fact for those of you who didn't know, this is actually something that historical ninja would have done, using fake versions of themselves in order to trick people. And I do think it's interesting that we're actually seeing that here. I think that is pretty cool. And when it comes to the traps, we only ever see two of them on screen. We see Whiplash and some of the Skullkins getting caught in a trap going after who they think is Jay, and Cruncha and Knuckle end up getting caught in a glue trap when they go after who they think is Kai. But still, I do think it is pretty cool that we get the chance to see something like this. The group then meets up and they talk about how the Skullkins ended up getting caught. However, Samukai and a bunch of his forces show up. However, as it turns out, the team also planned on this as well, as a bunch of nets end up dropping on the Skullkins, and the team ends up fighting against all the Skullkins. And we end up getting some pretty cool scenes of the ninja using Spinjitzu to fight against the Skullkins. We even get a brief acknowledgement of the Skullkins being able to use Spinjitzu, which is something that was actually the case when it came to the earlier days of the franchise. even though it's something that we never actually saw happen in the show, there were actually some pieces of media for Ninjago stating that some of the Skullkins did actually know Spinjitzu with Garmadon teaching them. However, again, we never actually saw that happen in the show, and unless I'm wrong, this is actually the only piece of media for Ninjago where we ever do actually see the Skullkins using Spinjitzu, excluding stuff like the spinner cars, for example. But still, I do think this is something pretty cool. Ultimately, though, the ninja are able to defeat the Skullkins. However, Samukai once again ends up escaping, and he makes his way down into the underworld, where he ends up encountering Garmadon. And after failing a bunch, Garmadon believes that he is the one who has ultimately won the wager, and he wants Samukai to admit defeat. Samukai, however, refuses to actually do that, and he ends up going deeper in the underworld, hoping to find some way of getting out of this deal with Garmadon. However, that doesn't happen, leading us into part 2 of the initial opening story at the beginning of the graphic novel. We see Garmadon confronting Samukai again, with him trying to collect what Samukai owes him. However, Samukai refuses to hold up his end of the wager, even though he did end up losing. So Garmadon basically ends up torturing Samukai by electrocuting him. And while this does end up satisfying Garmadon for a bit, Samukai ends up revealing something. As it turns out, when it comes to Garmadon, his own will has been the thing that's been keeping him around in the underworld this entire time. However, that's not going to be able to work forever, and eventually Garmadon is going to disappear into nothingness, and he needs the golden weapons in order to properly escape from here. Something that Garmadon was aware of. However, the only way Garmadon can actually get the weapons is with the help of Samukai and his Skullkin warriors. Without them, Garmadon is just going to end up disappearing. And Garmadon points out how this is an interesting problem. And it is something interesting because when it comes to Garmadon and Samukai, despite the fact that the two of them hate one another, the two of them essentially need one another. When it comes to Garmadon, he needs Samukai and his Skullkin warriors in order to actually get the golden weapon so that way he can escape. Meanwhile, when it comes to Samukai, Garmadon is the one in control of the underworld, and he essentially needs to keep Garmadon around in order to eventually regain control over it at some point. And so again, it is an interesting situation. And this is what I brought up earlier when I said how when it comes to the wager, it doesn't really work out for either of them. Because Samukai does essentially lose with him not being able to defeat the ninja, but in a way, Garmadon also ends up losing because he can't just get rid of Samukai, otherwise that would result in him just disappearing. And so it is a really interesting situation, and I do honestly think that what we ended up getting here was pretty good, actually. So anyway, the graphic novel then comes to an end, with things essentially going back to the way they were with Samukai and Garmadon. The two of them still have this rivalry, and the two of them still hate one another, and the two of them are both trying to figure out what to do next. And when it comes to Samukai, he ends up thinking about the ninja and the golden weapons and what to ultimately do about them. And then, and this is something that I really like, the graphic novel comes to an end suggesting the idea of Samukai ultimately wielding the golden weapons at some point and using them against Garmadon, which is something that would actually end up happening during the final episode of the pilot season, and that would ultimately lead to Samukai's defeat and death, which is something that I do think is interesting. We're essentially seeing that idea being set up right here in the graphic novel, which again, I think that is honestly pretty cool. And the graphic novel also ends up ending with a line saying how the ninja will return in the next graphic novel, The Mask of the Sensei. And that is where the challenge of Samukai comes to an end. And honestly, I think this is a really solid starting graphic novel when it comes to Ninjago. It's something pretty basic overall, nothing too complex, which I think does make sense considering, again, this was the starting point for the graphic novels. Plus, not to mention Ninjago at this point, again, this was still the beginning. Things were still pretty simple overall when it comes to the franchise, and there wasn't anything too complex yet. That wouldn't really happen until later seasons. But still, I feel like as a starting point, this is honestly pretty good overall. We get the chance to see the ninja in action, we get some pretty decent fights here and there, we end up seeing some pretty creative plans from Samukai, and when it comes to Samukai and Garmadon, even though we don't see them interacting that much throughout the graphic novel, we only ever see this at the very beginning and the very end, the stuff we do get with the two of them I think is genuinely really good and some of the best stuff in the graphic novel. Again, their dynamic and rivalry that they have is genuinely really interesting, and I honestly think it's a shame that we didn't see more of this in the pilot season. I think it would have been so cool if we got the chance to see more of this, and I really like that in this graphic novel, we got the chance to see more of the rivalry and hatred that Samukai and Garmadon had for one another. It's something that is really, really interesting, and I think the graphic novel did a genuinely really good job at handling this. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. So tell me down below, what do you guys think? Tell me what are your guys' thoughts on the challenge of Samukai, and was there anything that I left out? Again, tell me down below, and I hope you guys enjoy. Later, guys, this is Dimension Master Studios, signing off.